Cool! That's right, boys. Mondo cool.
Digital Devil Saga is a sub-series of the Shin Megami Tensei franchise. It takes place in the same universe and has familiar elements, but is its own standalone series that doesn't require knowledge of other games in order to understand what's going on. Like most games in the Shin Megami Tensei franchise, this is a turn-based RPG developed and published by Atlus. Digital Devil Saga takes place in an area simply known as the Junkyard. The inhabitants are comprised of 6 different tribes that are constantly locked in battle with each other in order to take over each other's territories. However, one day, this is all changed after a strange object appeared and impaled the inhabitants of the junkyard with a sort of white energy. This energy then caused them to transform into demons, which also caused them to become cannibals, forced to eat each other in order to sustain themselves. To top it all off, we have a mysterious woman that appears out of the aforementioned object, to which she finds shelter with the Embryon tribe, which is also the tribe the main protagonists of the story are members of. The game does an excellent job of not only setting up an interesting and unique world, but intriguing concepts and mysteries that compel the player to want to know more. Sadly, this does bring me to a problem, which is that this is in fact a duology. This game's story is, for all intents and purposes, the build-up for Digital Devil Saga 2. Given the nature of how the narrative is presented, expect for some, although thankfully not all, of the mysteries to go unsolved until you get around to the sequel. That being said, we otherwise have a very well-written game that tackles multiple complex and mature themes. While mainline Shin Megami Tensei games typically deal with the themes of order and chaos, this game, while still lightly touching on those familiar themes, it mainly deals with questioning reality, as well as questioning how well you know and understand even you yourself. Something interesting about the characters is that all of them start off completely monotone and emotionless. Yet, throughout the story, usually because they're triggered emotionally in some way, their personalities awaken and they begin to feel and act like individuals. This is, however, with the exception of the main character, Surf, who is a silent protagonist. This is pretty common for Shin Megami Tensei games, but unlike the more well-known Persona games, where you have several dialogue options to give an illusion of personality that you yourself assign to the character, Surf, on the other hand, has very few of these, and they don't really affect anything. Thankfully, the other characters surrounding Surf do well in picking up his mute slack. We have a colorful cast of characters that are interesting to watch, ranging from the hot-headed Heat, the cold and calculating Gale, the empathetic Argilla, and the Rasta Swagman Cielo. I can't say I disliked any of these characters. They were all really interesting and I very much enjoyed getting to know them. It's with pleasure that I can say that this game has intriguing mysteries, mature themes, and well-written characters. The writing is easily one of this game's strengths, and it acts as a strong driving force for the player to continue on in order to satisfy their curiosity of the unique world they were dropped in. This game is one of the earlier examples I can think of for cel shading in games, and since generally speaking, games with cel shading tend to hold up better than those that don't, I can safely say that this game still looks pretty damn good. The character models in particular still look stellar and reflect Kazuma Kaneko's style to great effect. Kazuma Kaneko has a very distinct art style. Even if it's reminiscent of the more typical anime art style, it's still very clearly his own unique design specific to him. With his very specific style in mind, it was clear that cel shading was undoubtedly the best option to bring it to life, and it more than succeeds here. Now, as for the environments of the game, they're very reflective of the game's overall atmosphere, which is dark, gloomy, and even somewhat depressing. This is due in no small part to the excellent design decision of making the junkyard a place where rain never stops. Not only is this great for the atmosphere, but it even serves the writing, as the rain can be interpreted symbolically. The rain never ending can reflect the never-ending conflicts in the junkyard. The droplets of rain can reflect the inhabitants and how insignificant they are in the grand scheme of things. Rain, in and of itself, is usually synonymous with sadness and depression, which can reflect how the inhabitants generally feel about their current lives, and many other things that you can derive. So not only is this one of the better looking PS2 titles, it has an excellent atmosphere that in turn supports the narrative. Most Shin Megami Tensei games have music mainly composed by Shoji Meguro, this one being no exception. I absolutely love Shoji Meguro's music, and a big reason for that is his excellent range. While the Persona games have more upbeat and poppy types of songs, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne had a more sinister, somewhat gothic sounding soundtrack that fit the demonic tone of the game. Given the gloomy atmosphere of this game, Meguro appropriately accompanies the game with a lot of atmospheric sounding electric guitar, which again works great for the dour tone of the game. Now that isn't to say there are a lot of sad sounding songs. If anything, there's only a few of those. The songs have a more heavy feel to them that accompanies the visuals excellently. This is easily one of my favorite soundtracks by Meguro in that it both accompanies the game very nicely and the songs themselves stand up on their own and are just really well composed pieces. Moving on to the voice acting, we have a very strong cast. This is a cast completely filled with familiar voices we've all heard before. Even if you don't know them by name, I assure you that you've more than likely heard their voices more than once. Crispin Freeman, Stephen J. Blum, Amanda Winley, Dave Wittenberg, Wendy Lee, and Mary Elizabeth McGlynn being the most notable voice talents. I really didn't find much fault with the dub. These are just really talented people giving really solid performances. It should be noted right away that while most other Shin Megami Tensei games have some sort of emphasis on demon collecting, Digital Devil Saga stands out in this regard as it plays more like a traditional RPG where you have a party of 5 and simply focus on those characters. Admittedly, it is kind of ironic that the game being more traditional actually makes it stand out more within its own franchise. With that in mind, I actually think this is something the game has going for it rather than against it. The reason is because compared to other Shin Megami Tensei games, this game is easier to start off with if you want to get into the franchise as a whole. It still has a lot of what makes the franchise special and unique, but is less daunting due to this more traditional design encompassing the rest of the eccentricities and making them easier to approach. Jumping into combat, at first glance, it seems like your typical turn-based RPG. However, there are a few things here that are anything but typical. First off, Shin Megami Tensei games in general are notorious for their difficulty. Whenever someone complains that RPGs are too easy, this is the franchise you point to that laughs in the face of that claim. While admittedly this game isn't quite as difficult as something like Nocturne, this game is still a fair bit more challenging than your average RPG, and that has a lot to do with the game's mechanics. For example, whenever an enemy lands a critical hit or exploits a weakness, they get an extra turn, and whenever they're able to dodge, shield, absorb, or reflect an attack by your party, it also makes it so that you lose a turn. This all sounds really punishing, but thankfully it's a two-way street. You can do the exact same thing to the enemies as well. In that regard, while the game is definitely challenging, it remains fair. This also isn't a game you can easily muscle your way through. Unless you're completely obsessive about grinding, your stats, while do play a role, aren't as important as your tactics. A player with low stats but knows what they're doing is going to have an easier time with a boss compared to another player with higher stats but isn't as familiar with how the game works. Getting away from combat, we have a skill tree system known as the Mantra Grid. This allows you to learn a different assortment of skills from physical attacks, magic spells, and passive buffs. My only problem with the Mantra Grid is simply that you can only equip at a save point, which means that once you master a slot and gain its abilities, you'd just be wasting the points that you get in battle that could be going into a new one until you change it. It would have been better if you could just simply change these on the fly as opposed to at a save point. It's otherwise a cool system that lets you customize your characters how you want. Now, some may argue that this takes away from the character's sense of individuality, and while that's true to a certain extent, the game does have a good way of getting around this while still keeping the game balanced. Your characters can only equip a certain number of skills at once, which makes it so that you have to think about what skills you're going to equip to what characters, keeping them different from each other so that they're all useful for different reasons, which still retains that sense of customization, even if you learn all the skills in the game. Now, that being said, if you're playing the game normally, you're more than likely not going to learn all the skills, as it takes a lot of grinding. Only completionists need to worry on that end. On the topic of completion, this game has a wealth of content, but unfortunately, trying to actually 100% the game is made needlessly time-consuming. If you want to defeat the secret boss of the game, you can only do it during New Game Plus. Having pulled it off personally, let me tell you, not worth the effort. The boss fight is ridiculously tough and requires farming for stat increasing items, and even then you have to abuse and exploit in the AI to actually beat him, even if you have max stats. Just don't do it, trust me on this. The reward isn't anything special either. Ignoring the secret boss, there's still a lot of extra stuff in the game outside of the main story, even if it doesn't seem apparent at first. You actually have to go out of your way to find these extra areas and bosses, which I think is pretty cool actually. Not only is this game fun to play, but it has a wealth of content to really get that bang for your buck. Digital Devil Saga is an excellent turn-based RPG. It looks great, sounds great, has excellent writing in terms of how it handles its themes, world building, characters, and plot, but also delivers challenging turn-based combat with a very customizable skill tree system and tons of content. While there are some snags here and there, the game is just so well crafted that they become rather easy to ignore. If you have a PS2 or a PS3, as you can download it on the PlayStation Network, and want a new RPG to play, this should be at the top of your list. This has been Shintai, folks. Take it easy.